So with that, I just wanted to start by thanking you all, thanking Valerie for building this fabulous program, and Jill for continuing on, and Jan and Annie and some of the others that have been involved behind the scenes on this, and then all the volunteer hours. It's really impressive, and I'm grateful for you all. So my outline, why bother studying prairie streams? And when people think of prairies and grasslands, they don't tend to think of the aquatic parts of it. I'm going to try to convince you that they might be more important than you perhaps thought. How humans are altering them, and then go into some of the details of what we're doing here on Konza. Turns out that grasslands are globally important, and a lot of runoff comes from grasslands around the world. And that we might actually increase our grasslands with global climate change, because one of the predictions is with the more active hydrologic cycle, we're pumping more water into the atmosphere. And so areas that were formerly desert could slowly convert to grassland, more grassland type habitats. So these are the grasslands of the world, and we're obviously right up here, but there's quite a few other tropical, subtropical, montane grasslands spread throughout the world. And if you pay attention, these are actually areas that are a lot of them are pretty important for agricultural production and are important areas in the world. And if we just take some pie charts and divide up the surface areas of those, we see that tropical grasslands and temperate grasslands and montane grasslands make up perhaps a third of the Earth's surface. And so they're quite important there. And if we look at the amount of runoff that comes, we have perhaps a fifth or fourth of the runoff on Earth actually originates from grasslands, which means that it's really, really important as far as global biogeochemistry and how the Earth's hydrologic cycle works. So that they're of global importance. In addition to that, most of the research that's been done on streams has been done in these sort of temperate forested streams right here. So it's one chunk that's missing. The other big chunk is the tropics. That people haven't done much work on that. Maybe it'd be more fun to be in a tropical stream right now, but so what are the qualities of these streams? So the first one is flood and drought. And this is basically a function of why we have grasslands. We have grasslands because you have enough rain. Well, if you don't have enough rain, you could have grass and not trees. If you have more rain, though, and you're in an area where trees can grow, such as here, and many grasslands, the trees will take over unless you have fire. And if you won't have fire if you don't have dry periods. So if you have dry periods and you have fire, right, and then you have grasslands, you also have flood periods and drought periods. So they're characterized by intermittent flow. They're oftentimes many impermanent streams of grasslands. Another thing that's different than forested streams is that when you go into the smallest streams, the headwaters, they tend not to have tree canopy over them. So it means that they get more light and they get less leaves. And it changes the way the food web operates. That is that you have invertebrates that eat algae, not invertebrates that eat leaves, and it alters the energy pathway flows through those systems. They're also characterized by quite good water quality. And this actually has practical importance, because if you look at some of the debates that have occurred over controlling water quality, there have been these sort of, they're not really analyses, but people have said, oh, well, there's settlers' accounts of bison fouling the stream, and making it undrinkable. And then people went out and took early pictures of sort of large plant growths in Illinois and said, well, look, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. So we don't need to worry about water pollution, because historically water quality was lousy in prairie streams, but it turns out not to be true. and that's a big part of the research that we'll talk about is actually to say what are the reference conditions in prairie streams and what were the reference conditions in much of the central part of the United States prior to cropland being put in, the sod being posted. And then there's also some unique species that are found nowhere else. Specifically, the only endemic species on Konza is a mayfly of plants, animals, anything. The only endemic species that's been identified so far on Konza is a mayfly, Leptophlebei konzai. And if you go out to the freshwater springs out here, at this time of year, you could probably catch those larvae of that mayfly. And the reason for that is that there's not a lot of endemic plant species, is that the grasslands are fairly recent. That is, they reformed after the glaciers left, and this transition from an aspen spruce wetland, aspen spruce forested area to a grassland. And so there just haven't been time for a lot of unique species to evolve, but the aquatic species, apparently some of them have done that. In addition, we have some species such as the Topeka shiner, which are now endangered, and Flint Hills is sort of the last bastion of those particular species. Now that particular species is not currently found in Kings Creek. It's not in the McDowell Creek watershed for some reason. I don't know why. But it is in the Deep Creek next one over, except for Deep Creek almost completely dry now. So, except for that part behind the Pillsbury Crossing, which it's probably holding. They can live in still water if they have to. So, this drought's going to have some pretty disastrous consequences for some endangered species. There may be a few species of mussels in this part of the world from that. Okay, so flood and drought, and being mid-continental, there's the occasional rainstorm, and Jim and I were just talking about how we could use less occasional rainstorms. This needs to be a little dry now. And in the late 1980s, Dr. Kelliker put together weirs on Konza, where we can measure discharge. And this is for watershed N4D, and for 20-year record of discharge. And the one on your left is plotted on a log scale, so it blows up the detail in the bottom part of the graph. And the one on the right is just a normal linear scale. And the points I want to make here is that we have these periods of, say, up to a year where we have no flow whatsoever. And then we have other years where we have flow continuously. And then our big floods on Konza, actually, 93 had some pretty good ones, but the very biggest ones that we saw were in 1995. And that particular flood pushed a 20-foot or so wall of water down past the Nature Trail Bridge, took the bridge out, just topped up on that high bank on the far side, spilled on this side, it spilled over the bank. There was a USGS bridge that they put up for water that was supposedly a 50-year return interval bridge. I think it was up for maybe 10 years before that was knocked down and strewn all up and down. It does look like a cement mixer came through, or a heavy equipment came through, just rearranged all the gravel and everything. So this is a harsh habitat for organisms to be in. They really have to deal with some really extreme events. We call this life on the edge. But they seem to hang in there. But then we're adding, what would you say, insult to injury, perhaps? And the things that we're doing to grassland streams in this part of the world and elsewhere. And these include the effects of dewatering, we'll talk about climate change, nutrient pollution, and species extinction. I always give such cheery talks. Just an aerial photo of the Kansas River near here to indicate, we have the cropland right up to the edge of these, which can put sediment in and nutrients in, and some of the human impacts and the development that's gone on around essentially all of the larger rivers and many of the smaller prairie streams. And we're fortunate in the Flint Hills in that the human management, what we want to get, the ecosystem goods and services we want to extract from this environment and can do so the most profitably are based on growing cattle. And in doing the way we grow cattle is very similar to the way the system was naturally. That is, we have repeated fires to keep the grassland there, and the cattle in some ways are analogs for bison. So ecologically, we're not way different than this was before the heavy European influence occurred on these grasslands. So just time scale here, and any place that was plowable by the early to mid 1900s was the sod was busted, and this led to a lot of siltation, suspended sediments entering the system. So when the Fremont expedition came by here, they said that the Blue River was a clear, handsome stream. It is maybe handsome at times. It's certainly mostly not a clear stream ever now. So that was a big change. And then the next sort of big change, we have these two droughts in the Dust Bowl in the 50s, and perhaps another one we can put in there now that's almost coming to rival those particular droughts. And then irrigation intensified and reservoir construction drastically altered the characteristics of the streams and rivers. And this in particular, western Kansas was using the overall aquifer. So this is just one small river that's flowing in western Kansas. And you see that in the 1960s to the 1970s, the long-term average of flow was up here. It essentially didn't dry, and then here it's frequently drying, and the average flow is substantially less, right? So this is discharge on the y-axis for 1932, about present. And this happens all over the western Kansas. So this is the Arkansas River here, and it is at the point where it flows across the Colorado border into Kansas, and then at Dodge City. And there's a little bit of missing record in here, sort of back around the Dust Bowl, but this is again on a logarithmic scale to expand the lower end of that. And I've added 0.01 cubic meters per second to it, so anytime it gets down to that 0.01, it's dry, right, on this particular graph. So we see that through the Dust Bowl, the Ark River still continued to flow. And this is important because it's an alternative for Cheyenne Bottoms and Quivira if they dry for the waterfowl if they're moving through the system. And as we moved into this intensification of agriculture, reservoir, and holding back water, Colorado started holding a lot of water in the 60s and 70s and really dropped the discharge. And then Kansas sued Colorado the first time. They've gone through it several times since, and they popped the flow back up again as Colorado allowed more of that water to get back in. But it essentially maybe dried once in that whole record of history. But if we go downriver from there to the Ark River, we see that it's a dry channel most of the time. And that with that center pit irrigation and traffic into reservoirs, so it's really drawn for water. And so the Great Bend Sewage Treatment Plant is now oftentimes the headwaters of the Ark River.